apropos of the technology, there was an interesting column this week in the New York Times. Ezra Klein has a podcast, and he was talking about the impact that Heschel's book, The Sabbath, had on him as a young man. And he then went into a long discussion with Judith Shedovitz about her book on the Sabbath. And they went back and forth talking about Heschel and contemporary technology. So there must be a connection between Heschel and technology, and we'll see exactly what that might have meant as we go along. I've tried to present to you essays rather than the whole book, or many books. So I've tried as much as I could to find resources that are online, so that as you read through the syllabus, you'll see links for reading that will be helpful to you. And there also are scans of some articles, and the articles will be sent to you like in advance of a week. And they're really more for reading and reflecting after I want to encourage you to consider purchasing the book that's called Spiritual Audacity, Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, which is Susanna Heschel's book. And if you click on the link for this session of Susanna's book, you will be able to read her introduction. And her introduction tells a lot about her father's life. So let me just say that I want to look for certain major themes. I want to be able to see Heschel's academic history, the constructive theology that he created, and what I'll call enacted theology, how that led to certain activity in the community. And you'll see a lot of that will come up in the film that we're going to look at tonight. Heschel is very sensitive to language. There's a link to some poetry that he wrote as a young man, still in Europe, Yiddish poetry, some of which has been set to music even. And he wrote in multiple languages. He wrote in Yiddish, in German, in Hebrew, and in English. So his first languages were Yiddish and Polish. And he then learned German, and he learned English, supposedly, I think this is probably true, after he came to England and then to America by reading the King James translation of the Bible and reading it in relationship to his knowledge of Hebrew. And that gave him a sense of the cadence of language, and that may account for the quality of his language. So I just want to share with you some key terms that will keep coming up at different points in his reading, in his writing. Hold on. So some of the key terms that will come up, and we'll talk about them as we go forward. Polarity. He will often use the term rather than seeing something as just a one-way. He'll often set up polarities, and we'll see them as going a relationship going back and forth. the word amazement or radical amazement, meaning a very deep amazement that leads to greater awareness. The word ineffable, and it's not even clear how he came to that term, but it seems to mean something that is beyond the everyday and something that is not able to be fully understood. He will often use the word mystery more than any other Jewish thinker. He will use the word mystery. That is part of why actually the Catholics liked him so much, because they are also used to using the word mystery in terms of their theology. Transcendence. He develops an idea called depth theology. As he says, theology is mostly an explication for the public of a belief system. Depth theology is the individual relationship with questions, as well as a sense of immediacy in relationship to God. The word pathos will come up often in relationship to understanding the prophet and the relationship of God to history and to the world. He'll often speak of witness, human beings as a witness. He will also talk about self-understanding. That is part of the goal of a religious life, is self-understanding, but also self-transcendence. He will talk about the polarity between Agadah and Halacha, between, we'll call it theology and law. And he will also talk about the polarity between anthropocentrism and theopocentrism. That is, how is the Bible both, on the one hand, a book about people, and also in some ways something that discloses about God. So there's a lot of terminology, and as we go through it, you'll begin to become a little more familiar with it. I want to take us to a film by Dobermeyer, called Spiritual Audacity, the Abraham Joshua Heschel Story. And I'm going to do it from the PBS link that we have here. And hopefully, and then afterwards, we'll come back for just a very few minutes of discussion after the film. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share sound, share screen. Let's see if you can see this application. Come on. We're going to go to there. Sorry. There. Okay. Okay, here we are. Can you hear it? Can you hear it?
No,
No,
no, and can't see it.
Front lines of the historic civil rights.
It's all distorted.
Okay, hold on. Supposedly in the way. Let me go back, stop share, share screen, back to that. And hopefully that will now work.
Alabama, standing
Yeah.
along with Martin Luther King Jr., is one of the most remarkable religious figures of the 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel.
I think they became friends, but more than friends, they became brothers.
He was the authority on the prophets, but on this occasion, he was the prophet.
Abraham Heschel is plucked from the fire of the Holocaust that will take the life of his mother and sisters. And in 1940, he arrives in America.
And he's already come out of this magnificent dynasty of rabbis that go back for centuries. He's part of a dynastic royalty.
He lived in excruciating ways with the reality that as the world and the family he grew up in was destroyed in Europe, most of the world was in fact indifferent.
Welcome back. Can you hear me? Okay. So it's a very powerful film. I forgot to actually give you an intro to it so that you would know what to expect. But maybe that had its own value. So I'm interested, first of all, in your initial reactions, and in order to do so that I know who you are and etc. At the bottom of the screen, there's something that says reactions. It's like a little picture of an emoji. And if you click there, it'll tell you when you can raise your hand. If you raise your hand, then I can call on you. But I'm going to ask that we not try to speak all at the same time. So raise your hand, and we're interested in your reactions to the film and whether anything particularly struck you or surprised you. You're Jewish and you don't have reactions? Friedel?
Yes, it was a great film. I remember at university seeing Heschel towards the end of his life, and he had a wonderful sense of humor because he spoke for 20 minutes and then he looked up at us and he said, "Well, have you got any energy to hear me continue to speak?" And of course, this was at Convocation Hall at U of T. And everybody clapped and clapped and clapped. And 20 more minutes went by and he asked the same question. But, you know, we knew that he was an older man and didn't have a great deal of strength. And he was sitting down at the end. And we really just clapped to say thank you so much for talking to us. And it was time for him to go. This was near the end of his life. And it was a great experience. It was a great talk. And just seeing him in person for us, for Harold and I, was amazing.
So Heschel had a connection to Toronto, a family connection to the family of Rabbi Kelman. Rabbi Kelman's family and the Heschels were somehow related. Wolf Kelman, who worked at JTS and at the Rabbinical Assembly, was very close with him as a student, and then as someone who often would be of great private counsel to Heschel. Heschel had another connection to Toronto. Some of you may know that when Beth Tzedek opened, it didn't have a rabbi. That is, they opened, there was an issue between the two co-rabbis, and they both had to step down. And so the congregation has nobody to lead high holidays on the first time that the sanctuary is going to be opened for the high holidays. And the leadership turns to the Jewish Theological Seminary, and they send Rabbi Heschel. And Heschel was not successful here. They thought he sounded too Eastern European. They thought his voice was a little too squeaky. I often think that it might be that that experience is what led him to some of his comments about synagogue life in his writing. I don't know. I have no evidence of that. But he did speak then, and he came back many other times, both to Beth Tzedek and to other synagogues in Toronto to speak. Terry. Terry, we couldn't hear you. It was just reverberating. So please unmute yourself now. Okay, try again.
Okay, so my question is, was that you, three people to the left of him in the photo that was shown twice?
No, I can't. Heschel chaired the admissions committee when I came, and I came sort of with the imprimatur of one of his favorite students, and Josette and I would come to him for some personal counsel, and Josette actually made his plane reservations to come to Chicago to officiate or to co-officiate at the wedding of my teacher and his student. And it was Saturday night of that weekend, 50 years ago, that we got the news about his death. I was supposed to, along with my friend Howard Addison, we were supposed to pick them up at the airport. And he would come to Chicago for the wedding, and then he was going to go to California, which is where his wife was from. Sylvia was from California, and I think she still had mishpacha out in California. But I wasn't in any of those pictures. I wasn't in any class with him. All my relationships with him were on a personal, individual basis.
Okay, just very quickly, my reaction, I find it very interesting to have lived through all this and not realize what was really happening. And perhaps this is one of the perils of living through history. So I mean, now I've got a lot of background reading to do. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I think for some of us who are watching, seeing the images of the civil rights demonstrations and of the Vietnam War demonstrations were quite evocative and powerful. Heschel was very early on the Soviet Jewry issue, and in fact, he is one of the people who influenced Wiesel to go to the Soviet Union, and that later led to the book, The Jews of Silence. I'd simply say that Heschel felt very strongly that we couldn't abandon Soviet Jewry. That was a very important part of an agenda that he set for American Jewry that ultimately led to a great deal. Kathy, if you would unmute.
I was trying to get rid of something.
Oh, you weren't.
I didn't have a statement. Sorry.
Okay. Any other questions that are coming up? Steve Lisfield, wow, you might have been in one of those pictures.
I might.
Rabbi Lisfield is a colleague of mine, a very distinguished colleague, and you may have some personal memories.
I do. I can identify the people in the picture. They were my classmates. I'm a little older than you are, Rabbi Friedman Cole. And thank you for that warm welcome and for welcoming me. What I want, I knew Rabbi Heschel a little bit. I was in his home, and the film, the documentary speaks for itself. But you started by asking Rabbi Friedman Cole what stands out, what is a primary reaction, and I think it's the statement that you and I knew from then and now. In a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible. And what I felt about that documentary, almost every moment, there was some issue that I wanted to jump up and say, I'm responsible, I got to do something. As you listed, Soviet Jewry, civil rights, Vietnam, Catholic-Jewish relations, it just brought it out unbelievably. We're all responsible, even though we may not be guilty.
Right, and that was a very, as you say, part of that is the idea of the human being as a witness. We stand in the place of the divine. We represent God on earth. God has no visible symbols in our tradition except the human being who is in the image of God. So he placed a lot of emphasis. We have to act in partnership and on behalf of God. A very important idea that came up in the film is this idea that God is in need of human beings. The whole medieval tradition and the whole modern theological tradition is that God is transcendent and doesn't need us. We can't have an impact on the divine. For Maimonides and other medieval thinkers, if God were to change because of human action or prayer, then God wasn't perfect to begin with. So Heschel pushed back against that whole agenda using the mystical tradition in a particular way in order to say God needs the human being, and that plays a big role in his theology. He, at one point in an essay that you'll read, he says that is the central idea of Judaism. It is 9 o'clock. If people want to get off, you may. If you want to stay on for a few more minutes, there are a few more comments. Bill, you have to unmute yourself.
Well, watching the film, I couldn't help thinking that, you know, the Jewish people were so splintered. We don't really have a Jewish leader. There's so many different movements, the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, and so on. But I couldn't help thinking, comparing Heschel to Stephen Weiss, who did not speak out against racial discrimination, and who did not want to upset the Roosevelt administration that they were not doing enough to save Jewish lives. So, you know, comparing one to the other, I just couldn't help connect the two together somehow.
Thank you. I mean, it comes up both in Vietnam and in civil rights with the Catholics. Heschel was not, you know, leading the pack. There were a lot of people against him. Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote a major essay called Confrontation, where he actually says that Jews and other religious traditions should not be engaged in theological dialogue. That is really problematic because you can't really talk about the inside of your tradition in a way that other people will understand. And there was clearly, as you saw, there was other opposition. He internally at JTS, there was opposition to him. He was brought by Rabbi Finkelstein to serve as a counterweight to the social pragmatism of Mordechai Kaplan. Finkelstein was very worried that Kaplan's theology would take over, and the traditionalism of the conservative movement would be lost. And he reached out to Heschel, who had already, Heschel liked being in New York. He wanted to come back to New York. It had to be the right opportunity. Having come back to New York, having entered JTS as a faculty, the halachic scholars, the Talmud department, really scorned him because he was not a halachist. He was a theologian and he was a mystic. And they did not, Professor Saul Lieberman, Zichrono Livracha, one of my teachers as well, once introduced Gershom Scholem to a lecture of Scholom's about mysticism. He said that Professor Scholem is the greatest authority of Jewish mysticism in the world. As you all know, mysticism is nonsense. The study of mysticism is great scholarship. So Heschel was developing a constructive theology, trying to take mystical ideas and put it into an idiom and a language that was responsive to contemporary philosophy, and was using contemporary language, and he got attention. And that also, I think, bothered people that he got so much attention. Not Andrew Gann, but his wonderful wife, Margie. Oh, Andy is there. Okay.
Oh, he's there too. Just a question. You mentioned Elie Wiesel, and do they have a relationship?
Yeah, they used to. Wiesel used to come. Don't forget, Wiesel was single for a long time, and Wiesel used to come to Heschel's home for Shabbat dinners, and they sang Zmiros. You know, they sang Shabbat tunes.
Wow.
Only Heschel didn't have as good a voice as Wiesel. Wiesel had a very close relationship actually with JTS. He studied Talmud with Professor Lieberman, and he obviously was a house guest, as it were, with Heschel, and someone he had grown up with, Rabbi David Weiss, or Halivni Weiss, was his. They were kids together in Siget, so there were a lot of connections that brought Wiesel to JTS. Any other questions, comments? Israel Lakornik.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So in the light of the prophets as the centrality of his philosophy and theology, I have the impression, I could well be wrong, that the conservative movement didn't place much emphasis on the study of the prophets. Could you comment on that?
At JTS, the Bible department didn't study the Torah volumes, that is the Chumash, because to do so might lead to using too much biblical criticism. The Bible department was very much philologically oriented. It wasn't interested so much in the message, but it was interested in the history of the text. And when it applied that methodology to the prophets in a very powerful way, one could learn a lot, but not so much about the meaning, the impact, the significance of the prophets. What Heschel did, Heschel's dissertation was on the prophets. It was finished in 1937, 38. In order for a doctorate to be accepted, it had to be published. And Heschel tried to get it published in Germany, and Martin Buber blackballed it. And it ultimately was published in a publishing house in Poland, which enabled Heschel to get the doctorate just as or immediately before Heschel, along with all of what were called the Ostjuden, the Eastern Jews, that's when he was expelled. And he went to Poland, he went back to Poland, back to Warsaw, and was desperate to get out. And he went to London. And from London, he was then able to get to Cincinnati. Elliot Zinner.
Yes, Rabbi. Hello from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm really enjoying your session, and I've attended Bethsedic many times because my wife is from Toronto. Anyhow, I'd like you to, if you could, kind of expand. I like how you started out the session defining the terms that Heschel used frequently, among which is radical amazement. My notion of that is we can look at the world and see how it operates. By the way, I did try to count the seeds in a pomegranate, and I came up with 612. So I was a little disappointed at that notion that you hear it from Kabbalistic sources. But if Heschel were to expand upon his notion of radical amazement, which to me means there is a prime mover, there is a Hashem, there's something abstract that we cannot see that runs the world. How do you think Heschel might expand, amplify how he used that term, radical amazement?
So first of all, thank you for joining us. Secondly, I want to just make sure, I want to respond to Judy Libman's comment. Tomorrow, we're going to find out what happened with the Zoom links, and we'll make sure that operative Zoom links are set out for next week. Secondly, I want to say Heschel would sometimes begin a lecture. Imagine now it's the late 60s, it's the early 70s. He's a fairly well-known persona. He would come into a lecture and he would begin and said, I just saw a miracle outside. Did anybody else see that? Did anybody notice the miracle? And everybody's kind of like, no. Turns to whoever is holding the person's elbow and said, did you see? What is he talking about? And then he would stop and he would say, the sun, did you see the setting sun? So it was important for him to take note of the natural phenomena of the world, but to see it not only as a scientific process, not only as something aesthetic, but also as something that was revealing of a divine presence and a divine love. And the awareness of that is what was so important to him. I'm not going to talk about it much. I just want to allude to the fact that when Heschel came to America, one of the first things he wrote in Yiddish was in the or maybe it was in German, in the Aufbaum, which was the German Jewish newspaper in Washington Heights and in New York, were two essays in opposition to Einstein. Einstein, don't forget, was really big, and certainly for German Jews. And Heschel wrote that Einstein's naturalism was problematic for Jews. And he was a young man, don't forget. So he, even early, if he felt strongly about something, he was willing to, take that on and put it out there, even if it didn't always win him, the good housekeeping sign of approval, for those of you who are old enough to remember good housekeeping. We're going to stop now. I'm going to invite you to come back next week. Next week, we'll do more textual study and commentary and discussion. But I want to thank you very, very much for joining us this week. really feel badly, and I apologize for the problems with the Zoom link. I don't understand it. And I'm very grateful to Karen Goldstein, who is home and wasn't anticipating all the emails. And she wrote me back later and said, this was really crazy. If you want the syllabus, please call the synagogue, talk to Karen, and she will send that to you. Hopefully you'll be able now. Let me just tell you what there is on the syllabus from this week that you will want to find out, follow, if you're interested. Some poems of his. One poem just in English, another poem, 3 poems translated into English, but also with the Yiddish words and set to music. If you look under the Amazon.ca link to Susanna Heschel's book, Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, you can scroll to her introduction. That part is open for all readers. And that will give you a real sense of his life as seen through his daughter's eyes. When this film was screened for the Toronto Jewish Film Festival, Rabbi Yael Splansky and I, and Greg Beals was from the Heschel School, was the moderator, and the director of this film were in a dialogue about Heschel. And Rabbi Splansky has something very interesting to say about the 1963 Conference on Religion and Race. And I say a few other things as well. It's a very fine discussion. And Julian Zelizer, who teaches political science at Princeton, I think, wrote a book for the Yale Jewish Live series on Heschel. And he is interviewed by Elliot Cosgrove of the Park Avenue Synagogue. Rabbi Cosgrove conducts a wonderful interview, and Zelizer talks a lot about the political framework and background within which Heschel was writing. So these are really fine things. You don't have to read them necessarily for next week. They're just at your leisure whenever you want to, but just know that those links are there. Again, I want to thank you very much for joining me tonight. And sorry we went a little bit later than anticipated. Be well. Shalom. Thank you.
Shalom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yesh koach.
My pleasure.